I'm so glad you brought it back to our personal practice because that really is the key. It's where it begins for all of us. And, if I think if we're receiving good instruction and sort of practicing classic mindfulness, which comes out of many traditions, but which is not purely simply about, sort of calming and coping, but really is opening up to awareness and insight, then that naturally does begin to connect us with that interconnectedness. And it makes it harder and harder for us to live in denial of our relationship to the suffering in the world, our own and others. And that's why I think, perhaps mindfulness, even if in some corporations has been used mainly to help create higher performing workers,
right,
who get sick less often or something, but I still hope it's kind of a Trojan horse, because inevitably, practiced well, it opens people's eyes. It just becomes harder and harder to walk by that homeless person. That's one of the things I've always loved about one of the practices we do in the Zen Peacemakers. We do street retreats. Small groups of people would go out on the streets for 3, 4, 5 days with no money and just experience that world. And some people that haven't done it have accused, it's some kind of voyeurism or it's this or that. They just haven't been there yet. When we're out there, we know we're not homeless, but we're still immersing ourselves in that world. And I've never seen anybody do one of those retreats and be able to walk blissfully by a homeless person ever again in their life. It changes that experience for them forever. And they generally become much more relational and really wanting to at least stop and acknowledge that person in some very human way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think this is wonderful and so necessary. I'd like to come. You were talking about privilege, and there are many kinds of privilege, racial and gender and socioeconomic and many others. And I'd like to address race and socioeconomic status for a moment to begin with, in talking about what's known as the mainstream mindfulness. You and I go to the conferences, mindful leadership conferences and mindfulness conferences and scientific conferences addressing mindfulness. And as we all know, it's a very white audience, a highly educated audience. And that's not an indictment. That's just where our culture is at the moment. But it points to where we're not yet and where we need to go. The Western Buddhism, which is not the only source of mindfulness, but a primary source of classical mindfulness instruction, is also still very white. And there's a lot of communities working hard to make it different. Many, many communities in the U.S. are working to become more inclusive and figure out, how to attract and empower people of color to be teachers and leaders and so forth in their communities. And so that's great work that's being done. But I find in the secular or mainstream mindfulness settings, it's even whiter and even more privileged. So although I'm very happy that mindfulness is going into the corporations and into corporate healthcare and many other settings, and because I think it can inevitably will do some good, and it could eventually do a lot of good. But my real concern is where mindfulness is not going, and the people that don't have access to mindfulness. That's the benefits of mindfulness. And that's just kind of my bent, right, to be concerned about that. And, and I don't even know, it's not that I have assumptions that that people in every culture or every setting from every background are going to like mindfulness or they're going to want mindfulness or in what form it should be. Maybe it has to be in a completely different form. I don't know. But at the very least, I want to create opportunities for mindfulness to become more available in the country. And thus, we're trying to train teachers who will feel comfortable taking the practice into more diverse settings. And you and I are both engaged in this work of trying to bring mindfulness into the criminal justice setting and hopefully to the communities that are impacted by that. We were both at that Mindful Justice Initiative meeting, and as long with people like ourselves and leaders from the criminal justice field, we had restorative justice advocates, we had victim advocates, we had representatives of the community.
Exactly.
So, we've been working hard to engage Mindfulness Institute to attract students from different communities. We've made a relationship with Howard University in Washington, D.C., and we've had a couple of students each year there, young emerging leaders who are graduate students at Howard University. And we hope to attract many more students in that way. And again, I don't have assumptions about how mindfulness should be or how it's going to work for different communities. Right. But I would at least like to create the possibility that we can find out, or we can allow them to find out and maybe facilitate that in some way.
Yeah. Well, you raised a lot of very interesting and important aspects of this
Well,
work.
I just want to say one thing. It's also, I would say the same thing when you go to these, secular mainstream mindfulness events. It's very, not only is very white, but it's pretty highly educated. Vast majority probably college education, above BA and above for the most part. But also, of course, the socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
So people of lower socioeconomic status, whatever color they are in this country, are not currently, having access to some of these things that it's just on the simplest level are good for your health, if nothing else.
Exactly. Yeah, these questions of access are really central to my concerns as well. And I think that, again, holding complex problems with the complexity that they're due is, for me, at the center of what mindfulness may offer to any one of us. We all have complex problems that we're trying to sort through, but then again, to the work that we might do to bring this into the world. And so, looking at how it is that our practice communities are disproportionately white and middle to upper middle class, and all of the different things that you alluded to, just sort of bringing awareness to that is an important first step in having that kind of deep engagement with the complexity that's arising when we really try and look and unpack what we are seeing. Because there are a number of different dimensions to all of that, and so to see clearly what's going on is to help us open up to different ways of addressing what's going on. So if a part of it is the teaching communities are disproportionately coming from kind of a white background and a set of experiences, drawing on their own positionality, which we all inevitably do in the work, and in that way, not necessarily representing ways of really kind of connecting with experiences that are very different from different kinds of positions and backgrounds. So if the teaching communities then are, disproportionately coming from certain sectors and social locations, then it shouldn't surprise us actually, if part of what happens is people kind of check out those invitations and opportunities, look around, see who's in there, ask themselves if there appear to be people who can really offer some kind of deep connections with the kind of life and experiences that I'm deeply engaged with. And if there isn't some indication that kind of capacity is present, and we can signal, we can do lots of different things. There are many different ways we can try to make that, deepen that capacity, as I know you're doing, Fleet, with the teaching that you're doing with the Engaged Mindfulness Institute. The idea being to deepen the capacity for all of us to really present what we're doing in ways that are very inclusive. And yet, again, for some of us, that really does require or mean diversifying the teaching community, presenting these practices in communities that are accessible, right, as opposed to having them away at retreat centers that are difficult for people to access. The cost is related to the distance from where people live, but not only about the distance, right? The actual cost of participating in these various communities that we often are privileged to participate in leads to, again, patterns of inclusion and exclusion that dovetail with maybe race and ethnicity, but also, as you mentioned, with class and sort of access to those kinds of resources and education, which is related and associated. So again, to look at the structural underpinnings of what we're seeing in the world, I think is part of what these practices can help us do. And to think then, if it's about finances and economic access, how are we doing in terms of finding ways to support access with scholarships or other opportunities for people to pay transportation costs or actual participation costs, waiving those fees. So again, concretely looking at what are we doing structurally to support making these opportunities available broadly. But it is, I think, a real ongoing challenge given the way our society has really normalized resegregation and the idea that it's totally okay to live in communities that are more and more characterized by racial identifiability, class identifiability, and this sort of kind of tendency that comes with that to have these fairly homogenous kind of bubbles that we live in.
Yeah.
And I, you know, as a child of the 70s, right, born in the late 60s, really actually, you know, really feeling like I was born right at the moment when we're sort of grappling with the pain of the loss of hope, maybe, that Martin Luther King represented, you know, sort of really coming of age, right? Or not coming, being born into a world soon affected by his assassination, and not only his assassination, as we all know, that cultural injury, sort of shock that was both the civil rights movement, but also the kind of backlash, if you will, or the, you know, the dislocating effects of these changes that many people fought for, and I wouldn't be here without. But what's happened underneath has been a lot of kind of emotional reactivity to all these changes, you know, and a kind of a tendency among many of us, and again, this is why we need mindfulness and compassion, to sort of be vulnerable to the politics of fear, be vulnerable to the idea that, you know, there's a way we can be safe that really doesn't necessarily require us to be deeply engaged with one another and go to school with one another. And yet research has shown that those kinds of actual integrations, living and working together and having projects together like this one that you and I will be involved in and have been involved in, these are actually the kinds of things that research shows actually diminishes the you know, tendency we actually seem to have again and again to structure our communities such that we have to work really hard to integrate them. Integration does happen, but it requires us to name it as a value and actually engage in specific concrete programs and policies, take actions, right? This is the engaged action part of it. Take actions that are really aimed at supporting what we know can work when you bring people together. So there's, for me, I look at, I do, I am a sort of I am in an academic setting, so the idea of looking at the research, not just the sort of neuroscience and neurobiology, which confirms this idea that there are a lot of fear-based structures, threat structures that do arise when we are, you know, challenged with or invited into change and sort of engaging with the so-called other. And at the same time, there are opportunities and ways of working with our fear, our habits and patterns around negativity, bias, and threat reactions. And again, a lot of research showing us that mindfulness and compassion practices are really, really helpful for this. But there are other studies that I tend to bring to bear as well, which are specifically looking at how it is that we create inclusive communities, how it is that we create a sense of identity safety, and bringing those two bodies of research together has really been a passion of mine.